So Emma is a young lady that we treated at Fresh Start, so that's why I called it Emma's device. And when I first learned about this device, there was no device. I read an article and I saw a picture of a contraption that looked like an erector set around a little child's face. And I went, and this is the kind of child that the erector set was around, and it was like, oh my God, that's terrible. And I was standing with somebody talking about plates and screws that are used to fixate bones, and all of a sudden the light bulb went up, and I thought, you know what, I can take an orthodontic device and make an internal device. So this is just the history. This concept started in long bones in Russia, and in New York at the university, NYU, Joe McCarthy put on these contraptions and published this, and I, in 1993, thought these contraptions are rather archaic and barbaric for both children and their families, and so we kind of thought, what can we do to make an internal device? And once I had this little light bulb that I could attach plates and screws to a little screw that would drive it, much like when you use a palate expander. In fact, that little expander was our first device, and in my friend's garage, we soldered the screw to some plates, which you'll see in the next slide. And, we had some families that really had no other alternatives, and we recommended that we try this little device. And so we sterilized it, and we tried it in 3 children. It worked beautifully. And I went to talk to a company. I went with a non-disclosure, and I went with a provisional patent. So I did get royalties, but I don't make a lot of money. And we started with a little iteration. We'd walk around hardware stores, and we said, well, maybe we could make a little chimney, and you could reach in and just screw this. And this is like a facial advancement in a little child that can't close their eyes, they can't breathe normally, and there's so much compression on their brain, they get high pressures, and they get brain damage. So this was one of our first patients, and we brought this child to the operating room, and you'll see the artist's depiction of what we're going to do in the next slide, which really allows us to kind of take this little screw and advance that whole facial skeleton forward. And then it's removed, and you see the child a year later. And most of these children were able to get the tracheostomy out. They're able to close their eyes to protect their eyeballs. And this, again, is just an example of the child before surgery, and you'll see how the face and the skull reshape afterwards. And in the gaps that are created by our bone cuts, new bone forms. And so just like when you break a bone, callus forms, and the callus eventually gets seated by new bone. In this case, what we're doing is we're actually literally stretching this kind of bubble gum-like callus, and then when we hold it in position, it forms bone, the cells grow into it, and we can take the devices off, and the children, do very well. So operations like this at Boston Children's would be, a 15-hour procedure. We're doing these in about 3 hours. The children usually leave the hospital within a couple days, and the parents turn these devices. Everything's buried but the little cable, and the parents turn the device, and gradually, as that whole face moves forward, it corrects the deformity and the bone fills in the gap. And I think in one of these slides you're going to see a child having the device turned, and at first we thought, oh, they need a lot of pain medication, and really now they may need a little Tylenol, but very little. And especially when you're moving the skull bone forward, if you do that suddenly, you have a very high frequency of infection, and unfortunately, intracranial infection leads to death in about 10% of patients that develop it. So it's a very severe problem. And we've been able to reduce the infection rate in these cases to well under 5% with no mortality. This is a child from Phoenix who came in, and it's not because her eyes are big, it's because the skeleton didn't develop properly, and she really can't close her mouth because the skeleton is tilting up. It's not because she's opening it. And we're able to correct this, remove her tracheostomy, and we can improve the aesthetics. And so this was really great. The real problem with the device, though, was you did have to go in secondarily and take the device out. And that was a second operation. It had some blood loss. The children were swollen. So when resorbable plates and screws, which you see on this side, came to the market, there was a company in town called Macropore Biosurgery that a couple of us helped launch. And on a weekend, we went out to Macropore and we designed a resorbable distractor. So all of the plastic melts away, and then through a little incision in the temple, we were able to just slip the little driving device out. And so I think one of our first patients, actually, I remember the editor from the Journal of Craniofacial Surgery came to see our first case. He said, "How many have you done?" And I said, "This is the first one." So this was our first case, and you can see how preoperatively the girl, her whole face is recessed, and then afterwards, really, she becomes a normal child and a normal looking, not only looking, but functionally doesn't have pressure on her brain. And this is the little girl I started with. This was the reason I thought we should do this, and you can see, how we've been able to treat her. So it's a really very exciting thing. Unfortunately, not everything has been discovered, and, it's wonderful to have the FDA, but my professors sewed little grafts on their wives' sewing machines because people died if they ruptured their, aortic aneurysm. Now, people will die, and we'll go to the FDA and make sure that we do all the right things, but I don't know. There's a balance between creativity and, very safe applications in patients, and of course, those of us who really want to make people better understand that balance inherently, and somehow we don't think that we're taking real risk because we think we're really helping people. Thank you very much.